I just noticed looking around here that you've got red up here. You've got a red smokestack in there.
That is for really a special purpose. You don't find many ways of telling people that you are rather socialistically inclined. And red is their favorite color. Their flag is red. Therefore, I want to advertise that fact.
For sure.
Anyway, that I have very definite socialistic leanings, and I want those leanings to show even in my summer home.
Yes, folks. I'm Matt Weck. David Griscom still in London town. That based Frank Old Farmer, as Big Daniel says in the chat. A little guy by the name of Henry Martinson. Patrons have been introduced to Henry this weekend. We had film guy Matthew on to talk about a documentary, the first in a trilogy on the North Dakota Nonpartisan League. And that was Henry Martinson, who was one of the goats of the organizing movement. Had a lot of time in North Dakota labor movement, lived nearly 100 years. And we will be looking more at Henry specifically with the other two installments of the Prairie Fire documentary. These are directed by John Hanson and Rob Nilsson in 1978 to 1980 period, about the North Dakota farm labor movement, which fed into what we'll be talking about with tonight's guest, Anders Lee. And my computer's freaking out a little bit, and I'm the only host, so give me some feedback in the chat if something happens technically. But as long as we're here, Anders has a great piece in Racket magazine. This is from, I believe, a while ago, March 27th, 2023, this year. How Hubert H. Humphrey purged DFL of socialists. That is in the link below. Before we get to Anders, usually David does the econ monologues, but there's something that's I've been seeing on the timeline a little bit, and I think I can help. Let's take from most objectionable to least objectionable. Assuming I'm still having a connection here. Crap. Let me make sure. Are we still good? Are we live on a Twitch too, folks? I just got an error message. Okay, well, it looks like we're doing fine. Sorry. That'll be the last time I get anxious about that until you guys tell me to. But so from most objectionable to least objectionable, here is Derek Thompson. Now, Derek Thompson isn't a bad guy. He's not somebody who we're probably going to invite on, say, Majority Report. But he's like a sort of standard liberal magazine writer. And he had this to say on the state of the economy. The U.S. has the fastest growth rate of any G7 country, and the U.S. has the lowest annual inflation of any G7 country, and Americans hate it. And continues, two charts president wants voters to see some charts as opposed to their bank accounts. But anyway, here's what Thompson says. As for explanations, real wages declined in 2021, 2022. There's some evidence recovering in 2023. We'll get to that. Also, consumer sentiment is all negative polarization now. So Republicans tell pollsters they're living through the apocalypse. But Republicans would disapprove of Biden either way. If his poll numbers are so bad, it means Democrats aren't feeling that too. But anyway, Americans are just in a bad mood. Now, there's a piece I saw right before going live that kind of gets to. I'll be honest. I haven't read this piece here by Eric Levitz. This framing of it by Jonathan Chait doesn't inspire a whole lot of confidence, but I think I know what he's getting at. But anyway, even after accounting for inflation, the real hourly wage in the U.S. is now nearly 2% higher than it was before the pandemic. Eric Levitz on the mystery of Biden's terrible approval ratings. Now, what they're reacting to is what Harold Meyerson is talking about in this. Now, Harold Meyerson, I think, is good. I think the prospect is good. This piece has a lot of value, or there's something to take out of this piece, even though I find it kind of annoying for the same reasons I find those other people who are like, well, there's this small metric that we're measuring, wage growth, I guess, not small metric, but why isn't everybody happy? And, we should note, I believe, that as Meyerson does in this piece, specifically like what the economy has done regarding the like quit rate, for instance, the quiet quitting, and also the people doesn't want to work anymore, that whole dynamic, what that actually meant, and how that was facilitated by government policy. And I don't think that should be lost. That's not me trying to apologize for Joe Biden saying that. I think there is a huge effort to try to not let people realize what the government did that was good during the pandemic and make it seem like it was all just some dystopian fight for it. But ultimately, the real thing is like, guys, okay, so your wages for the lowest income has gone up a little bit. Look at this thread here pointed out by, or this research pointed out by another DSA member here, Renee, on Twitter. Supply of rental units affordable to lower and middle income renters fell by 3.9 million over the last decade, according to Harvard JCS. So it's nice to get a little bit of a raise. But if we just click through this, I need to share this actual thing. It won't follow you. If we actually click through this, it's fucking awful. Like, look at all of these, the lowest income, just the amount of units available to people. So it's like, yeah, you might have more walking around money. Maybe that's true. But this reminds me of a joke we made on the Michael Brooks Show live show about UBI. And if you do not take the hooks that rentiers have out of people with regards to these essentials like rent, a few like some like a universal basic income that can help. That, I don't want to say that's not like relieving stress on people, but guys, if you can't rent, what do we think we're doing here? And I think like Meyerson is the least objectionable, but like when I see like national magazine writers who I imagine earn six figures talking about how like, oh, wages have gone up on these metrics, like that's good. But look at the rest of it before you act so perplexed, is all I want to say about that. With that, well, I want to welcome our guest for this evening, Anders Lee. Anders, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Hey, Anders Lee here. Thanks, Matt, for having me on. Appreciate it.
Anders, apologize for my pronunciation.
Oh, it's all right. No, it's my stupid catchphrase that I always say.
Anders is a co-host of Pod Damn America and also the Paid Protest podcast, formerly of Redacted Night. Author of this piece, which I have linked in the show notes here, How Hubert Humphrey Purged the DFL of Socialists. And let me down. I'll be honest, Anders, I have focused a little bit more on the North Dakota side of things. And so I appreciated the opportunity both to read your piece and also the documentary that you sent me, which I also linked to. But the DFL is something people probably hear first on like the news, and maybe if they go to vote, and probably their eyes gloss over. It's just something on paper now. But if you overheard somebody at a bar, say in St. Paul, talk about the DFL, what is the DFL? What would you try to say to maybe excavate a little bit of radical history to them?
Yes. A lot of people in Minnesota, they're just two extra letters that don't stand for anything. My first exposure to it was the booth at the state fair, but it stands for Democratic Farmer Labor Party, because there used to be another party called the Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota that was far more powerful and prestigious than the Democrats. And eventually in 1944, they had to merge. And to this day, they are still combined, at least on paper. They are still technically the same party. It's a merged party. There's no singular Democratic Party in Minnesota. And there's a long history of social struggle within that those two words in the title, farmer labor. I'm sorry, I can't.
Sorry, I was muted. That was my bad. Here is just a short clip, and then we'll get into some of the history here. But what I find interesting also is Stadeberg, I think her name is, well, one of the early organizers, female, like women all over organizing this. Anyway, let me just play this clip here and we'll come back to it.
In 1924, Mahoney and Stageberg brought together a coalition unique in the history of American politics. More than a political party, the Farmer Labor Association was the grassroots core of the movement, designed to educate, organize, and represent the two great producing classes, the farmers and the workers.
She's rolling from the farm fields onto Red Wings River shore.
The association, through its member organizations and local clubs, developed platforms reflecting farmers' and workers' interests. Then they made sure their elected Farmer Labor Party officials...
Oops, sorry, my screen capture messed that up. But you kind of get the gist there. And what I find fascinating about this is I had sort of, I think, maybe assumed that there was more independence between the Farm Labor and the NPL, which is a nonpartisan league in North Dakota. But actually, this is a case of the farmers in North Dakota starting this, the nonpartisan league, which again we'll get into. We got into a little bit for patrons on Sunday. We'll get into in the post game tonight. But the farmers saying, you know, we're tired of getting screwed over, and that inspiring farmers in Minnesota, like basically coming. North Dakota as a North Dakota, and I know that one of the last places sort of taken over by Uncle Sam in the continuous United States and last to be settled. But it's like that sort of populist energy coming back and then crashing through the farmers. And then in Minnesota, you have a different makeup. You have the more industrial workers as well.
Yeah. So beginning in the early 20th century, the Midwest, the Plain States are a hotbed of socialist activism, especially before the Bolshevik Revolution. In North Dakota in particular, though, there is a vibrant and active socialist party, but they're having trouble establishing a foothold because a lot of farmers feel alienated from the socialist struggle because, as you say, it's an industrial struggle primarily. But when it comes down to it, their interests are really aligned because capitalism just doesn't work for even conservative farmers. They find that this is just a very unstable system and they need some sort of support. And I'm sure you've covered A.C. Townley, brilliant organizer who is able to establish the nonpartisan league. I believe at first it's like a farmers nonpartisan league with the direct mission of organizing farmers and you know, not necessarily explicitly in a socialist way, but they're able to really take control of North Dakota's government and establish a state bank, state grain elevator. And people in Minnesota see that. And I believe in the 19-teens, they try to expand east to Minnesota. They started national headquarters in St. Paul, and they are really there. The Nonpartisan League is really present during a trolley car strike in Minneapolis, and they're really one of the only formal organizations that's supporting these workers. And so they're able to really establish a foothold and start to think about alternatives to the two-party system, because at this point in North Dakota, they've used the Republican ballot line, which is so fascinating in retrospect. And they're starting to do the same thing in Minnesota, and they think, well, let's just do both parties. Let's take over both major parties. But the thing is, at that point in Minnesota, the Democratic Party is like nothing. They had, I think, one governor in the early 20th century, but they are just a real dearth of a party. They're like the Green Party almost today. Right. So they say, let's just do our own thing. It's going to be easier that way, and we can have a clear program that we can put forth to farmers and laborers.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to jump the gun too much, but the success of FDR kind of doomed the farmer labor movement. Well, let's save that for a little bit later. That
Sure.
state bank in North Dakota paid for me to study abroad in London.
Oh, wow.
I actually took my a loan out from that. Yeah. And, you know, A.C. Townley, very interesting guy for the Nonpartisan League. Yeah, like you said, like a lot of the early organizers were socialists trying to get traction and facing a similar problem that we all butt our heads up incessantly today, which is the two-party structure and the difficulty of breaking out of that. And so the Nonpartisan League itself, that name tells you, like, we're going to run on whichever primaries, on whichever ballot lines we can get on. We don't really care because none of these people are coming for us. And North Dakota had that openness because there was already a history of basically governors being installed representatives of sort of the financial interests in Minnesota. It's like a sort of early thing loosened up to create those open primaries. And like you said, like initially they started off with having more success on the Republican ticket in North Dakota as well, and ultimately basically becoming a joint operation with the Democratic Party and getting less and less radical.
Right. Yeah. Which is, I think, a really important, thing to still reflect on, though, for today when we have discussions about the party question, is that America has a very strange system where we don't really have real parties in the European sense. And this is a really great example, I think more so nonpartisan league, of just using the ballot line, and there's really nothing they can do about it. You can run on whatever platform you want, and there's no repercussions as there would be in Britain or other countries. And, I often think that these groups like No Labels today someone should try to maybe co-opt them by trying to bring the nonpartisan league back and maybe bring on some confused moderates to get some funding, but we'll see.
I've always thought Nathan Robinson was smart with the naming of current affairs, and we have a show like Left Reckoning, and I appreciate that because there's a whole bunch of different meanings you can have, but it also like puts the name on the tin a little bit more than like all these shows, like when we were doing the Michael Brooks show, names don't have, people are willing to give a person a shot before they're willing to give an ideology a shot. So I think it's interesting the lessons that they learned to get acceptance. And Townley himself driving actually to the Model T was a big part of his organizing, basically driving from farm to farm and talking to folks, having a sales mentality. Actually, it reminded me, like, if we have any sales folks in the Left Reckoning audience, like your skills can come in handy. Like I've done some phone banking and stuff. My dad's a salesman. I am allergic to that sort of thing, but the idea of applying those skills to organize folks, which is literally what these guys did, is I think really inspiring.
Yeah, I would love someone to help us pitch Pod Damn America to some patriotic folks out there in the heartland. But no, I know what you mean with the sales thing. It's funny. I've had two different types of canvassing jobs. One for nonprofits, just bugging people in the street, which is way worse for some reason than just going to people's doors and asking them, like, will you support this cause or this candidate? It is interesting how much like people can be driven and motivated. Even shy people, Midwestern folk like ourselves, can be driven by a political program.
Right. Now, so the Nonpartisan League has some big success. That the Red Scare that follows, Bolshevik Revolution and World War I, really, I'd be curious your perspective. Here's actually some documentary we'll play. It completely, really hurt the North Dakota Nonpartisan League.
League organizing took place during the height of U.S. involvement in World War I. The Republican administration, aided by the Home Guard and Main Street Patriots, carried on a campaign of harassment, branding both farm and labor militants as disloyal and jailing leaders for sedition.
There were people hung in effigy, and there were actual people tarred and feathered. It was a violent campaign.
In 1917, the legislature set up a special Minnesota Commission of Public Safety to suppress dissent.
Members of the Public Safety Commission who directed it were mostly corporate leaders from Minneapolis. They saw this as an opportunity to extend their power across the state and deal with a number of the challenges to their power in Minneapolis through violating what today we would see as basic civil liberties.
John F. McGee became de facto leader of the commission that targeted groups well beyond opponents of the war.
The League worker is a traitor. Where we made our mistake is in not establishing a firing squad in the first days of the war. We should now get busy and have that firing squad working overtime. The disloyal element in Minnesota is largely among the German and Swedish people.
The Public Safety Commission, in trying to take care of its perceived enemies across the state that brings farmers and laborers together, they all experience this repression.
That really did cause people to think about where their political loyalties really ought to lie and who's going to be on their side.
Strong hand.
thought that was fascinating section there. Yeah, talk about the Red Scare moment.
Yeah, well, when I think about World War I in the U.S., I feel like the term manufacturing consent could probably best be there, which I think maybe is even the genesis from the guy who coined it. But the amount of sentiment against the war is really overwhelming going into 1917. I think the most popular song in the country in 1916 is "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier." And all of a sudden you just have this rash of laws and just power grabs on federal, state, and local governments to crush dissent against the war. And it's one of those things where it's like the propaganda is very, very heavy, but and I feel like people don't always remember this point, which is, part and parcel of the manufacturing consent thesis. Propaganda is not always 100% effective. It doesn't always work on everybody. It often doesn't work very well at all. And so you have, even during and after the war, especially after the war, a lot of Americans very upset about what just transpired. And you have, the only response of the government is to just call people Reds or German sympathizers, which does start to have more of an effect getting into the 20s when you have the Palmer raids, where there are, there's a bombing on Wall Street, and just I believe thousands of homes are raided by federal agents, and people are persecuted and put in jail, and just all these things we talk about today are starting, I guess, during the Bush administration, about the Constitution being torn apart and all this stuff. Like this is not a new precedent. Like America has gone through phases of this many times before, and I think World War I is a really stark example.
Yeah, that's such a key point. Like, there's a way we remember the McCarthy era as if like that was the one time that we did that, and
Right.
it flares up in the 1870s and 1880s, definitely in the 19-teens, and of course in the 1950s. It's something that could easily happen again. I mean, to the extent that it isn't happening sort of on a slow boil at all times, and then comes over. Now, there's this other piece here on the industrial sort of workers, and there's, like you said, like that the initial. Actually, I can't. I wish I didn't mess that clip up unless I got it. That clip where the farmers in North Dakota. Here, actually, let me play this one. Here's another from this documentary, which I do want to cite. It's linked in the description.
The movement's focus on economic issues brought people together across powerful racial and ethnic divides. African American farmers became active members of the League. Labor and civil rights leader Nellie Stone Johnson was born to William Allen, a farmer, and Gladys Allen, a teacher, in 1905. She grew up on farms in Minnesota's Dakota and Pine counties.
My dad was a member of the Nonpartisan League. I was very familiar with the League and read many of the papers. I was 13 doing the distribution of literature to the farmers. I just propped the material up on the horse's saddle horn so I could read it.
Nonpartisan League gains inspired organizing among farmers in northwestern Minnesota and beyond. Their goals and successes attracted workers in cities too, despite traditional tension between urban labor and rural farmers.
What brings these two groups together is a streetcar strike that occurs in St. Paul in 1917. When no one else stood with Minneapolis and St. Paul workers during the streetcar strike, the Nonpartisan League stood behind them, donated funds, and spoke out on their behalf. And they began to see that their interests were really not so different after all.
As a mark.
Yeah, I mean, really like inspiring stuff. And the type of thing where it's like, I wish maybe this was taught.
Yeah.
We got taught Lewis and Clark maybe every single year. That's great. But
Right. I mean, Minnesota, it's hard because you have so many strange, like Jesse Ventura was the governor there. So it's hard not to get lost in that, or just I mean, like every state, there's a very rich history. But I think this is kind of kept from kids in a way, not in a conspiratorial way, but it does. I think the way you learn about history in Minnesota is just kind of like, oh, that's just the Democratic Party. And I guess they were like two things, but it's not really seen as this distinct formation that existed for, a few decades and was incredibly powerful. It's just kind of seen as like another analog for the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and I love that Nellie Allen. I appreciate that documentary because, like, I think Allen's been mentioned in books I've read, but to see pictures and to see, hear her words, not her actual voice, but um, like she's tailor made for a story. I didn't understand North Dakota's diversity like that. I'll just confess it, right? Like a little black girl carrying socialist literature to farmers is the type of image that like I would invent like if I was trying to propagandize, if like Pixar gave me a contract, and then they'd be like, that's not believable, right? But there's like those are the real stories of this, and we have all this, this sort of like anxiety about race and how do we come together. It's like we've done this before,
Right.
right? Like, and yeah, I mean, I think it's just such a great lesson.
Right, which is, of course, not to say that she and other people didn't face racism in at this time,
Right.
but that was a key part of the FLP's platform was civil rights, and I think later was ended up being a way in which the Democrats tried to appeal. That was like one sort of progressive agenda item they were willing to take up, and I think that has to do with the FLP's early advocacy for civil rights.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things like I mean the role of women in both these movements, like to the point of you could tell like the suffragette movement and that sort of stuff was really in the air because I think it was farmer labor movement had a requirement for like one woman for every two men on boards like that. Fascinating stuff. Let's move a little bit into the height of the 30s. And there's got another clip from this documentary here about the Hormel chili strike, which another piece of history that I'm unaware of.
Yeah, I went to work at Hormel's over here in 28 down at Austin. I run a gang there at Hormel's for 5 years.
The work had become short weeks, cut pay, and here comes the form.
Not this guy's voice, but the first voice you're hearing is Frank Ellis, who's the meatpacking organizer.
To insist that you sign a card saying that you'll allow them to take money out of your pay to go to the community chest. And as the story is told, one of the workers said, they expect us to help the poor people. Well, we are the poor people. They started a sit-down strike, and they occupied the plant. This was in November of 1933.
It was the nation's first sit-down strike. Jay Hormel and other business leaders had been lobbying for Governor Olson to send the National Guard to Austin to open up the plant, citing chaos in the streets. Instead, Olson went to Austin to see the situation for himself. He saw disciplined, peaceful pickets surrounding the plant. He met with both sides at the Fox Hotel and mediated an end to the strike.
And at the end of 3 days, Jay Hormel gave in, and that union negotiated one of the most remarkable union contracts ever. They're going to get a stable wage every week, and they can't be laid off for 52 weeks. Needless to say, workers around the state of Minnesota and workers around the upper Midwest heard about this and were inspired by this. This was the breakthrough.
And we started organizing cooks, waiters, waitresses, bartenders, barmaids, and automobile workers and truck drivers and what have you. And we organized under the Independent Union of All Workers. And we got them organized solid, and when we were once organized, we were the power.
We're gonna roll.
Yeah. I mean, you hear about that, one of the best contracts ever, and that's one, both inspiring, and two, you realize, capitalists like learn from that as well.
Right. Yeah, because you have around this time what historians call welfare capitalism in places like West Virginia, where there's been really militant uprisings, and they kind of realize, like, I guess we got to throw them a bone here and there. So you have in other places company towns that are actually a little more generous than we're used to seeing. But yeah, in Minnesota especially, I think the ruling class is really on watch. They're very keenly aware of this growing movement, and they do what they can to compromise with it. That's definitely true.
What's your take on Frank Olson? He has a famous quote, was it at the convention or to the legislature, saying, "I'm not a liberal. I'll work with them." And what's your take on Frank?
Floyd Olson. Yeah,
Floyd.
He's a very complex figure. My main takeaway would be that he's an extremely shrewd politician, very aware of his political capital, very aware of all the different political factions within the state, which runs a gamut from communists, Stalinists, Trotskyists, and then on the right, the Citizens Alliance, which is an organization founded in the early 20th century, which is basically a business union, which starts to really militarize. He is a Hennepin County attorney at first. He takes over as the Farmer Labor Party's gubernatorial nominee in 1924 when Charles Lindbergh Sr. dies. And he loses the 24 election quite narrowly. At that point, there are two Farmer Labor senators, but really the main prize is the governor's mansion. And he says, give me 6 years. We're going to do this in 6 years. And that prediction comes true, elected in 1930. And he's a compromiser. There are certain things that he doesn't bite on at first. He's able to get certain things taken out of the platform that he thinks will prevent the FLP from getting into power. That's like recognition of the Soviet Union, nationalization of industry, but also something I found really interesting, which at the time is a crazy radical idea. Today, it's a very humdrum phenomenon because he has that, but at the time, that was like a very radical, kooky thing to propose. So he holds off on that stuff. In office, he's able to negotiate the Hormel strike, as you just mentioned. There's a farm foreclosure that he enacts, and he also eventually, in the convention you mentioned in 1934, then he starts to throw his weight around a little, and he pronounces, "I am a radical. I'm not a liberal," and they go balls to the wall on the platform. There is some speculation, however, and this really speaks to the phenomenon of Floyd Olson, that was a political calculation because he had, I guess, enemies or people he was a little wary of on the left of the party, because this was a pretty open party at that point. There was a paper ban on communists until 1936, but there were still, it was very difficult to enforce, very loosely enforced. So they let communists into the fold, and he was aware of that. And so by saying that, and it's hard to know, what the truth is, but that was kind of a calculation to prevent some of those more radical elements from getting elected into the legislature, so he could govern more from the center.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. I don't want to move too far off that topic. I mean, but I do want to you mentioned Charles Lindbergh.
Mm-hmm.
And, talk, for those who don't know who Charles Lindbergh is, maybe a brief intro, but yeah, how did his sort of arc, I appreciate the anti-war sentiment, not up to the point where you're taking pictures with Goering, right? Like, I think you got to find some sort of happy medium there, but yeah, talk about Charles Lindbergh.
Yeah, well, Charles Lindbergh Sr. was a congressman from Minnesota, starting in the early 20th century. He was a progressive Republican. He endorses Roosevelt in 1912, who runs Third Party, but then is very much opposed to Roosevelt when it comes to the war. He's a staunch isolationist, very against war with Germany. And then he is involved in the founding of the Farmer Labor Party, but he dies in 1924. And then Charles Lindbergh Jr. is kind of like all just the bad stuff about Sr. Like he, it's I wouldn't say Sr. was as explicitly anti-Semitic, but Jr. certainly is, and he's an aviator. For those who don't know, flew across the Atlantic, but really had some strange bedfellows and was advocating peace with Germany. Which I'm sure we'll get to this, but very odd time in retrospect, the anti-World War II movement, because there's a lot of leftists, a lot of communists who are against war for all the routine, usually correct reasons. But in this one instance, they happen to be way off, and they are making strange bedfellows with someone like Charles Lindbergh, who I think is I think it's fair to call him a fascist. And I would recommend the Plot Against America, the the book, but also the series about him in an alternate history of where he gets elected president. It's not good news for Jewish Americans.
And probably not helpful to try to like maintain, because Townley didn't turn out. I think he ended in anti-communism. Like, not super helpful. Henry Martinson, the subject of the documentary, is I'm going to be watching in the post game. He's a much better figure for romanticizing these movements. But I imagine like the Lindbergh thing, he's probably a big blot that makes it difficult to try to be like, oh, well, they had Lindbergh with them. He was a Nazi, right?
Yeah. You mean like for the Farmer Labor Party?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a very nebulous political situation at the time, even more so, almost as much as today, because the FLP, it has a lot of people who are isolationist, and they get involved in politics just because they're anti-war. And that includes people who are anti-Semites and xenophobes, and maybe they, have some populist economic ideas, but that's their animating factor in their politics is hatred in many cases. And so that's something the FLP is also contending with, because you have communists on the left, and then you also have some anti-Semitism. There's a Floyd Olson's lieutenant governor who ends up briefly becoming governor when he dies, Yelmar Peterson, ends up running two very anti-Semitic primaries against Elmer Benson, who ends up being governor after Olson. So it was that was definitely a presence in American politics at large, but in the FLP as well.
Yeah. What's your take on the place of cooperatives here? The documentary we're playing from shows both the sort of timber workers getting pissed about getting screwed over by like company stores and stuff like that, and then you have, we already mentioned, like the cooperative grain elevators and that sort of thing. Talk about cooperatives.
Well, yeah, Minnesota is to this day, I think, has the most cooperative businesses out of any state in the country, and that was certainly true at this time. Farmers were very attracted to the cooperative model because, as we're talking about, capital is a very unstable system. So this was a way of balancing against that, and it just made more sense if you're a farmer. So you have a lot of people who are sort of conservative, isolationist farmers who end up voting for the FLP and then taking part in these cooperatives. And there's a big section of the Farmer Labor Party that really wanted to expand that model to the entire economy into something called cooperativism, kind of a mouthful to say. And in my opinion, and this is, not everyone would agree with this, I think it's basically socialism, just a series of democratically run economic enterprises, and also a state that runs certain facilities and businesses as well, and takes things out of the marketplace too. They kind of avoided the term socialism in a lot of cases for xenophobic reasons, but also for what we're mentioning earlier. Just if you're appealing to agrarians, did I crash?
Nope, you're still here.
Oh, okay, sorry, my computer's acting weird. If you're appealing to agrarians, then socialism was seen as like a very urban phenomenon. So cooperativism was more of a politically shrewd term to use.
Yeah, I mean that's really fascinating. It's interesting because like there's some co-ops in North Dakota too, electric co-ops, I believe, but they weren't politicized. Like when I would hear about them, it wasn't as if it was like, oh, this is actually something. To the extent that you understood there was a difference between that and any other kind of business, it wasn't like you were politically educated about it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you lived in the Twin Cities for a while, right?
No, never really in Twin Cities.
Okay.
Fargo, Moorhead.
Okay, gotcha. In the Twin Cities, there's a ton of food co-ops that are they just kind of seem like hippy dippy grocery stores. And, in some respects that's not inaccurate. But they're, all the members pay an extra fee every time they buy something. My parents are members of Mississippi Market, shout out. And you get like a little dividend every year. But it's funny. There's a whole bizarre, fascinating, and rich history there too in the Twin Cities with the co-op wars of the 1970s, where you had some of these same issues coming to the fore, where there were Maoists and third worldists who wanted to run co-ops in their way, where they were like, let's sell junk food, that's what the masses want. And then the hippies, more of the Greens, who were like, no, we need health food. And there was all the while there was like a traditional Black American sort of community of food co-ops in North Minneapolis that they were, talking over. But that's that's a really part and parcel of Minnesota, and fascinating history as well.
One final clip I want to play, and I think you mentioned this in the foreclosure pause, but this is another sort of radical little moment. There's a lot of talk over different sorts of like types of nonviolence and things like that, and I think like it's all good for maybe streamers to hypothesize about this sort of stuff, but I'd prefer maybe just to like show actual history. So here's one of these instances.
So, creditors began negotiating with the association instead of forcing families off their land. It was one thing to challenge the local sheriff's power, quite another to defy federal authorities, as the Farm Holiday Association did in Montevideo.
It was a day perfect for thrashing, but within a radius of 20 miles around Montevideo, there wasn't a thrashing rig going.
There was a scheduled foreclosure sale, and they shut down the thrashing, and
I just want to say, God bless the makers of this documentary for getting guys like that on camera to share this. Like, I feel the exact same way about that guy sharing this story as that footage from like the 20s of like this guy that saw the Civil War talking to this. Like, I feel the exact same way, and I appreciate his energy for giving it to us.
And they shut down the thrashing, and everybody went to town, crowded.
The town was full of people as far as South Dakota, Iowa, North Dakota, and the poor U.S. Marshal. Actually, I felt sorry for him. He had a bodyguard. He said, "I'm here with the judge's order in my pocket," and he patted his gun. When someone hit the marshal, I turned him around and I told him, "There's about 6,000 of us here. You don't need to do that." The marshal called the federal judge. The judge said, "You can't do this. It's illegal." Harry Hoagland says, "We understand that, but we're doing it." They stopped the foreclosure.
Just after that gathering, John Bush got a call from Governor Olson.
Governor Olson told me he had a call from the president. He called me to tell me specifically. He knows you and he thinks you're doing a tremendous job, but you can't buck the federal government. You're going to spend the rest of your life in the pen. Well, I said, "Now, Floyd, up till now, we've hurt no one. You'll put me in the pen if it takes 10,000, 100,000. It takes I don't know how many. I'm not going to stay there. If you want a civil war, if that's what you're aiming for, that's the way you'll get it."
Instead of arrests, the militant, unified actions of the Association on Farms and in a mass rally at the Minnesota Capitol gained a state foreclosure moratorium. And, at the urging of President Roosevelt, Congress passed a law providing subsidies to farmers in exchange for cutting production.
I mean,
also shout out to the filmmakers for that killer fiddle music. All these these musical bangers we get from this doc. It's interesting. I was reading today that Floyd Olson issued that moratorium with really, really tenuous legal ground. Like, that was not something it was clear that a governor could do. But because he had such a keen sense of like what he could get away with or not get away with, he seized the moment, and the legislature, which included a lot of conservative Republicans, had their backs against the wall. So they just had to, retroactively say, okay, yeah, fine, moratorium on farm foreclosures.
I mean, fascinating, I think engagement with and victory over FDR there too. And maybe that can move us to like the final part that, again, I'll post your article for Racket here. And what is Racket? I've seen it around, but I've never done like the about page inspection on it. So if you want to introduce that to me and everybody else in the audience too.
Sure, yeah. Well, in the tradition of Minnesota Cooperatives, it's actually a cooperatively run and owned publication based in the Twin Cities, and it was founded by a group of people, including my buddy Jay Bowler, who used to write for City Pages, which was a weekly paper in the Twin Cities, which unfortunately, it was a great publication. Unfortunately, that folded a couple years ago. So some of the writers took it upon themselves to start this.
That's awesome. And so Hubert H. Humphrey, I recently mentioned Humphrey as not really himself, but the fact that I think it's significant that the Metrodome used to be called the Hubert H. Humphrey Metrodome, and we don't do that anymore for political leaders. And maybe that's a good thing, but I think it's a little bit of a dystopia that's crypto.com and maybe not like.
Yeah.
But anyway, Hubert Humphrey's not a hero or someone we should support. I didn't know that. I knew him as a sort of a basic, Democrat that wanted to be president, but his actions leading to talk about the merging of the parties and then Humphrey.
Yeah, so Olson dies in 36, and that's after the 34 truckers strike, where he ends up calling in the National Guard, and there's a lot of controversy about that, but he is running for Senate and passes away while he's still in office, and there's kind of a power struggle that breaks out. Elmer Benson, who's to the left substantially of Olson, takes over, and then within a couple years, and partially because Benson, although he's much more based and I like him a lot better, he does not have the same political shrewdness as Olson. And in 1938, the FLP gets swept out of the governor's mansion. A lot of that has to do with growing anti-war sentiment, and just the Republicans in Minnesota become kind of the anti-war party. And by 1940, one of the FLP's senators, Henry Shipstead, defects to the Republicans just to be an isolationist, say, I'm against this war. You also have their other senator who dies in a plane crash. So they all of a sudden, within just a couple years, just have all their major elected officials gone. So going into the 1940s, they're a really rump party. They're still doing better than Democrats, but the Republicans are winning all the elections, and this is in a progressive state. And so Roosevelt in 44 says, you guys got to figure this out. You have to come together and merge. And one of the people who presides over that is Hubert H. Humphrey. Now, on the FLP side, there is Elmer Benson negotiates the merger, as well as Susie Stegeberg, who is opposed to it. She says this is a bad idea. We should not make peace with these guys. We're in for a bad time. But they go ahead with it. And for a long time, or a couple of years, the FLP wing is really the dominant wing. They have Hubert Humphrey, who's the mayor of Minneapolis. They refuse to congratulate him for doing a good job as mayor. There's an official party letter that's sent, and they strike out some of the more enthusiastic language. And then in 46, or in 48 rather, he's really able to use a lot of the same tactics that leftists have used in the past to sweep the farmer laborers, especially the socialists, out of power, out of party, leadership positions. There's a anti-communist organization that he's kind of appointed to by Roosevelt, Americans for Democratic Action. And they pass around these leaflets will the DFL party of Minnesota be a clean, honest, decent, progressive party or a communist front organization? So they're not shy about red baiting. And then ultimately, through the caucuses, they get all these people who have never been to a meeting before to come in and vote their flank into office. Him and Orville Freeman, who is this other very young sort of liberal Politico, they formed what's called the Diaper Brigade, and they're able to basically purge the party radicals. And unfortunately, that year, one of the big hot button disputes is over the presidential nomination. Truman is running for the first time, and against him is Wallace, and so the farmer labor wing of the party wants to endorse Wallace, but Humphrey controls all the votes now, so they go to Truman, and then Benson, former governor, kind of takes his gang and they go to Minneapolis, and they have their own kind of symbolic convention where they nominate Wallace, and then he becomes Wallace's campaign manager. And sadly, the Progressive Party, kind of its third iteration at that point, really doesn't go anywhere.
Man, that's fascinating. A similar sort of dynamic happens with the Nonpartisan League, and the depressing, the sort of it becomes more of a. I mean, the radicalism is entirely stripped out over the next few decades, to the point where it becomes like we started at the top, just some letters you see on voting day. I'm curious, Minnesota has done some really good things in the most recent legislative session. How ripe do you think this is for any kind of resurgence? Like, I feel like what's wild to me is how similar a lot of the debates seem. Like the debates about should we merge with the Democratic Party, like, you could imagine similar factions breaking out. I mean, you can absolutely see it, like it's just obvious that would happen today, and on similar sort of like concerns. I'm just curious, like, what needs to happen? Because and another thing, like that Hormel strike, where they're talking about, let's pass around the hat. It reminds me of Starbucks workers saying, like we're literally like, you're going to fire me for like taking out like the expired food thing or something like that. But anyway, how ripe are we for that?
Yeah, well, I think speaking of the parallels with today and back then, another thing that really was reminiscent of today is the issue of elected discipline, which was a big problem back then too. That's something we're always contending with now on the left, is like, oh, this person betrayed us, so I guess this whole thing is all for naught. And a lot of people use that as a reason to not engage with the Democratic Party. But if you look at even pre-merger, there were people like Shipstead and others who just, especially people who are elected and go to Washington, they kind of end up, they're very hard to control from a party position. It's just it's a really hard thing to do, is to keep all your ducks in a row. But it is, I think, important to have like a core of cadre who have a platform that's deliberated democratically. You have processes to discipline members and electeds if need be. And I think today, if you look at Minnesota, it's far to the left of where we live in New York in terms of the things they're passing. There are just education funding bills that are getting passed. Trans rights, they're not shy about supporting. And if even on the local level in Minneapolis, the DSA there has really been able to take control of the endorsement process, which I think is an interesting phenomenon that I'm really curious about, because that's one of the debates we're having in DSA, is like, to what extent do we actually want to take over this party machinery? And what they've been able to do there is get party endorsements for DSA candidates ahead of the primaries. Recently, that ended up resulting in some violence, actually. The supporters of a city council candidate who was primarying a DSA member, they swage and were like, the cops, all kinds of like that. The key here, though, is a lot are up against it. So I think when you have a strong left-wing poll, that moves the rest of the party to the left. And even with Humphrey, as we mentioned, at that 48 National Democratic Convention, he goes there and he says, I want to be a civil rights party. I don't want to be a states' rights party. I want to be a human rights party, which is a very ballsy thing. To have to give him some respect, that's a ballsy thing to do in 1948 when you have a segregationist Democratic Party. And he's also in favor of a full employment bill when he's senator and vice president. So I think that the fact that you have that left-wing core there will pull some of those, liberals and ballyhoo artists, as Elmer Benson called Humphrey, in a good direction. But it also has limits, and we're seeing that today in Minnesota, because you have the Uber legislation, which really would have been a very radical step forward. And Governor Tim Walz, who signed a lot of other good stuff, was not able to sign that. He had to veto that because there's just a limit to liberalism that we have to be cognizant of.
Yeah, and I think what I find inspiring about it is the fact that so many of these organizers, the initial people on the ground, were like they're ideologically socialist, right? And not getting initial traction, like Henry Martinson, who I'm going to be talking about, was a editor of a magazine for years, for a few years, like, and then ultimately finding a way to, bring that to the people and make a dent. It wasn't a revolution like a lot of the people wanted, but it was a huge dent that had a massive impact. And Anders, I appreciate it so much. How you, Hubert H. Humphrey, purged the DFL of socialists. Where should people follow your work besides that?
You can find me on Twitter at Anders Lee here, and the podcast is Pod Damn America, and I'll have some more podcasting news soon in the works. So keep an eye on that.
Exciting. Yeah. Thanks, Anders. Appreciate it, man.
Thank you for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Likewise. All right, folks. That was awesome. I really recommend Anders' piece and that documentary, which I have so liberally borrowed from. Let me see if I can find this, if they have any credits. Oh yeah, here we go. Credits. I'm going to read the credits for this because I feel bad not signing it. Then we're going to go over to the fun half. This is a project team. Randy Croce. Oh, this is Randy himself. So Randy, who I linked to, his YouTube page only has 42 subscribers. Go give him a sub. I thought he uploaded that from somewhere, but this guy made this great documentary here. Check that out. Should we? Thanks for. I noticed we got a raid. I think that was the Surfs. Shout out everybody. I am going to head to the post game now. I'll try to be back very quick, and we'll run through those documentaries. I don't know if I'll be able to get to calls, but I will engage with the chats, and we will be live on Twitch as well. I'll keep it live to everybody as well. Just because David's not here, I need company. I really appreciate Anders. Let me just check to make sure we're all good here. All right. And we will be back. I'll be back live in about 10 minutes. I don't want to lose all the Twitch people, but I also need to eat a sandwich. So I'll see you guys in a little bit here.